Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos, Daf Tzadik Aleph. We're on the second line from the top. We'll move our discussion here. We just learned the Mishnah, a big chiddush that although the Chachamim determined shiur in various quantities, amounts required for the Malach HaVeitzah, Chacham gave us many lists of different materials and objects and items, and the amounts, the quantities required to be considered a davar chashav, a significant amount, so that they can perform a certain function, and therefore they are considered to be chashav in that amount only. However, the Mishnah told us that if one would have a specific need, even for a smaller amount, for instance, lezera, to go plant it, so even if he takes out a smaller amount, a small quantity, then the standard prescribed shiur, he is chayiv. Says the Gemara, on the second line from the top, Amar Vida Mashmo, Mechayiv HaRameir, Rameir, who's the Tana of our Mishnah, it's a Stam Mishnah, an anonymous Mishnah, which is presumed to be Rameir. So according to Rameir, Mechayiv HaRameir, Rameir would say that a person is chayiv af b'moitzi chita achas azriya, even if he merely carries out one kernel of wheat, if his intended purpose is to use it for zriya, for planting. Because in his mind, it's significant. It's intended for a specific purpose, specific use, specific function. Therefore, it is granted significance and chashivas even when it's only a small amount. So, pshita, of course, kol shu t'nan. The Mishnah explicitly told us that if the yitzah is for the sake of a specific purpose, for instance, a zera, even kol shu, even a minute amount is sufficient. So, what is the chiddush here that even one kernel? Says the Gemara, pshita kol shu t'nan. Mao the tema, perhaps I would think, kol shu la fuke migogeres. When the Mishnah uses the term kol shu, it's not literal. It doesn't mean literally just a minute amount, a kol shu, one kernel. The Mishnah is coming to contrast to the standard shiur when it comes to foodstuffs, oichlin, which is a shiur gogeres, the volume of a dried fig. So perhaps the Mishnah is coming to contrast to that. You don't need that much. But certainly adika kazayis, you need some sort of significance. You need shiur kazayis, kamash malan. Therefore, the Gemara teaches us no. If his intended purpose is to carry out this kernel for zriya, for planting, then it is granted unique significance, unique chashivas. It has a high level of importance, and even one kernel is sufficient for the Malach HaVeitzah. Says the Gemara, if so, if you follow a person's personal plan and intention, if that's the case, if he sets a standard for himself, Masklar Vitzchak, Brei David, Elamiata, how could you say that? Elamiata, if so, Chishiv Lo Yitzi Kol Beisa, if a person has a kavana, he has a plan, I'm gonna empty out the content of my whole entire house, in one shot, in one go, in one Maisa Hoitzah. Achinami Doli Mechayiv. Here too, are you going to suggest that he won't be chayiv adimapik l'kula until he carries it all out in one go, in one shot? So, if a person has the power to determine, to establish what is chashiv and what is not chashiv, in this case as well, in his mind, his ma'aser hitzah will only be considered to be significant and complete unless he carries out the whole content of his house at once. Says the Gemara, Chinami, here too, you're going to say lo mechayev adamapik l'kula until he carries out everything at once. Says the Gemara, no. Hasam there certainly batlo datoi. His mind, his intention, his plan becomes nullified. Eitel kol adam, in contrast to the comparative to the norm. So it's not norm to go carry everything at once in one shot, and therefore we certainly follow the standard shiur. What is considered to be chashav and significant to everybody, to the standard person, to the average person? That is what determines the shiurim of Shabbos. When we speak about a person having the ability, an individual having the power to set his own standards, his own shiur, that is only the chumrah. When it comes to being more stringent, so instead of following the larger standard amount, he can actually make that amount, the shiur, smaller. He can minimize it. Even a koshu could be sufficient, because he grants significant even to a koshu in his case, because he has a specific function, a specific purpose in mind here. However, l'kula, for leniency's sake, certainly we won't apply a kula, and a person can never say, well, the standard shiur which the Chachamim apply to average people, to normal people, to the typical person, won't apply to me. I need more than that. So once again, this concept is only l'chumra, not l'kula. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. Rashi is 8 lines from the top, beginning with the words Chishev lahoitzi kol beisei. Says Rashi, Chishev lahoitzi, he had intended to carry out kol beisei, his entire house, b'yitzah achas, in one go. The lo yachshava, so he didn't grant chashivas a significance. Elim kain hoitzi kula ka'echad. He decided that his malacha of carrying, his act, is not considered to be significant and chashiv, not complete, unless he carries it all out at once. Hachinami here too, the chi'afke purta. If he should carry it out incrementally, a bit at a time, won't be chayiv. Says more certainly he will. But ladaite, his mind becomes nullified. V'shiur the chashiv le'inshi chashiv. Whichever shear is considered to be chashiv, significant to the typical person, that is what determined, that is what it establishes, and he can't go above that. Says the Gemara, V'chol adam ein chayav and olav el kashiurei. So the Mishnah told us that if a specific person decided to, for instance, to store a little bit of seeds for the sake of planting, then indeed, when it comes to his malacha v'eitzah, he will be chayiv even a smaller amount, because he granted this small volume, this small quantity, a chashivas. But anybody else who would carry out this small amount won't be chayiv unless it contains the proper share, the proper amount. Says the Gemara, Masnissen, the loik of Shimon Elazar. Our Mishnah apparently is not following the shita of Shimon Elazar. The Sanya is what it writes, a klal omar of Shimon Elazar. Shimon Elazar established a rule. Kol she'enei kosher latzniya. If there's something that is not suitable for storing, it's not really useful. Ve'ein matzniya kamoyu, or perhaps the item is useful, but the quantity, the amount is not useful. So either way, it's deficient. It's deficient on account of its type, of its quality. Ve'ein matzniya kamoyu means this amount doesn't have significance. People would not store this small amount. Now, it found favor in this person's eyes. And he stored it. He decided, even this item I like, even this amount is sufficient for me. So he stored it. He granted significance and importance to this. It wasn't him who carried it out. It was actually another person, another fellow who was mitzi this thing. So for instance, if Ruvain stored it and Shimon carried it out, Shimon will be liable. He becomes chayiv machshavte shalzeh due to the machshava of Ruvain. In our Mishnah we see that is not the case. That the machshava of Ruvain only accomplishes for himself and not for anybody else. So we have machlekes between our Mishnah and Shimon Elazar, who holds that once an item has been granted importance and significance in its current form, its current size and shape and quantity by one person, by Ruvain, it already attains chashivas for everybody else as well. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rava, Amar Nachman. What's going to be in the following circumstance? So if one lifts, we know that a haitzah, a malacha haitzah, involves a two-phased process. There's the akira, and then there's the hanacha. There's lifting off the ground, and then placing it on the ground in the other rishus, in the other domain. Says Rav and then Rav Nachman. If one lifts a foodstuff that has a shear of a gegeres, of a dried fig, which is the proper shear, the proper volume for the shear veitzah, and his machshava here is la'achila. He intends on eating it. So far so good. And then he goes ahead, v'nimlach alel Israel. Then he has a change of heart, and he decides to use it for planting. Or in the reverse, inamil Israel, the initial plan was for planting, v'nimlach alel, and then he changed his mind, and he decided la'achil is going to eat it, and he did the hanacha with his second plan. Chayev, in this case, certainly is chayev. Why? Because, why not? There was a proper shear from the beginning to the end. There was a shear of kergeres, and that shear is sufficient for any one of these intentions. Pshita, says Gemara, it's very simple, that he would be chayiv. Zil hacha ikashihura. Now, when he lifted it off the ground, he did the akira, so it had sufficient volume, sufficient shear for any one of his two plans, for his initial plan or for a subsequent plan. Zil hacha ikashihura, whether If he would follow the initial plan, there would be enough there to satiate, to address and accomplish that plan. And whether we focus on the subsequent plan, on the second intention, there is sheer, there is enough volume during the akira to satisfy that as well. So therefore, certainly in this case, he's chayiv. So the Gemara is asking Anakasha, Pshita, why do you need to teach me this halacha? It's very posh. Isn't it self-evident? Why would I think that he's not chayiv? Says the Gemara, perhaps I would think, Bo'inan akira v'hanocha b'chada machshava. Perhaps both the akira and the hanocha need to happen with one plan, with one intention, one machshava, one continuous machshava, without changing plans in the middle. V'oleka, in our case, we don't have that. Kamash malon. Therefore, he teaches us, no, there's no concern here. We regard it as one continuous masa atzah, since there was a sheer, a sufficient volume, a sufficient quantity from beginning to end. So regardless of what his plans were, it's irrelevant, and it is considered to be a ma'isa hitzah. So once again, this case was where he lifted it off the ground, and it had a sheer, a gegeres, which is a sufficient amount for achila or for zriya. He placed it down. He did the hanocha with a new plan, with a new machshava. So if it was initially for achila, then the hanocha was for zriya, or initially for zriya, and subsequently for achila. In either case, as the Gemara is chayav, since there was no change of shear, the shear that was there during the akira was sufficient to address any of his two plans. Therefore, we regard it as one continuous maser tzah from the akira to the hanocha. Continues the Gemara, what's going to be in the following case? What if he lifts a half a gegeres with the intended purpose to plant it? Now for zriya, a chatzi gegeres is certainly enough. V'tavcha, now it bloated, it swelled. For instance, he cooked it and it grew. So it grew into a gegeres, and now he decided, he had a change of heart. He decided, I'm going to use it for achila. And the hanocha took place with a gegeres, because it swelled into a gegeres, into a full share. A gegeres with the intention of achila. So what is the halacha in this case? So once again, he lifted it when it only contained a half gegeres. His kavanah was lezriya, for planting, which is a half gegeres is certainly sufficient for that kavanah. It somehow bloated midway, v'tafcha, it grew, and it turned into a gegeres. Then he did the hanocha with the machshava of achila, and certainly a gegeres is a sufficient share for achila. What is the halacha in this case? Now, if you propose that Hossam, that in the initial case, in the first case mentioned earlier, he is chayiv, the zilhacha ikashura, over there, we understand why he's chayiv. Because during the machshava rishayna, during the initial intention, during the akira, there was sufficient amount to address everything, to address the initial kavanah and the subsequent kavanah. Because he had lifted it off the ground, for instance, for achila. It had a gegeres for achila. He placed it down on the ground later on for zriya, and it had a gegeres. So the shear that was present during the akira was sufficient for all his plans. Zilhachi kishura, whether we look at the first machshava, there's sufficient amount for that. V'zilhacha, go here ikashura. If you follow his subsequent plan, there was shear for that as well. So during the akira, there was sufficient volume to address all plans, and therefore he's chayiv. But in our case, once again, our case was a situation where he lifted a half a shear off the ground for zriya. It is sufficient for that. It satisfies zriya, because zriya doesn't need a gegeres. But then, subsequently, he changed plans. He decided he's going to use it for achila. And since it was bloated, it was tafcha, it became a gegeres. That amount satiates the achila intent, the achila purpose. However, when he took it out, meaning when he did the akira, it did not have enough for the shir achila, meaning the final plan, the final phase of his eitzah was a hanocha with a kavana for achila. That requires a gegeres, which was there during the hanocha, but that shir was not there during the achila, during the akira. So perhaps loy mechayev, he can't be chayev because he can't connect the akira which didn't have sufficient quantity, sufficient amount, a sufficient shear for the intended purpose during the hanacha. The hanacha was for the sake of achila, needed gegeres. That shear wasn't present during the akira, so you can't combine, you can't attach the akira to the hanacha. Oidilma, or the flip side, perhaps you can say, kibun di ishtik, kibun di ilu ishtik. Perhaps if he would have remained silent, meaning he would have remained with his initial plan when he lifted off the ground. He had machshava for zriya. Perhaps if he would have stayed with that plan, suppose he would have just remained silent, meaning he wouldn't have changed plans, and he would not have decided to alter his intention. He would have remained with the machshava of zriya. Mechayev and machshava de zriya. Certainly, he would have been chayev due to the plan of zriya. So he lifted off the ground a half a gegeres with the machshava zriya. If he would have remained in that mode, certainly he would have been chayev by doing the hanocha on that small amount. Hashtanami mechayev, says the Gemara here as well. He'll be chayev, although he changed his kavanah. He had a new plan here. He decided to use it for achila, so the hanocha of the gegeres for the sake of achila. However, since during the hanocha, the shear that is present right now, it can accommodate the current plan which is for achila. It also can accommodate the initial plan for zriya. Therefore, perhaps the akira and the hanacha can combine, be mitzdaref, and is considered to be a continuous ma'aseh hitzah and ischayev. So, although the plan changed midway, nevertheless, since the shear that was present during the hanacha can accommodate the initial plan, which was merely for zriya. So certainly within the gegeres of the hanacha is included the shear required for zriya. So perhaps that is sufficient. We can be mitzdaref, combine the hanacha with the akira, and he'll be chayiv. Says the Gemara, so now if you propose on this circumstance that he will be chayiv, if he would have remained silent, meaning if he would have remained with his initial plan, he would have remained on the zriya mode and simply deposited that chayfetz without changing plans, he would have been chayiv. Mechayiv machshava de zriya. He would have been chayiv due to the machshava of zriya. If he would have changed plans, so no question he would have been chayiv. Hashtinami mechayiv. Therefore, based on that reasoning, we're going to hold him liable now as well, because although he changed plans, nevertheless, the configuration doesn't really change drastically, because during the hanacha, he has sufficient quantity, sufficient volume to satiate, to satisfy the initial plan as well. So there's no interruption here, there's no termination. The akira and the hanacha can go hand in hand. So if you propose that that's the case, that in this case he will be chayiv, based on this reasoning, what's going to be in the following case? So we're building up. We started with a halacha, which is pashut. We went to the next case, which was an uncertainty of some sort. And the Gemara says, well, if you take on the stringent side of things, you say, well, yes, we consider it to be one continuous ma'aseh hitzah, and we combine the akira with the hanacha. Since the hanacha contains sufficient volume, sufficient shear to satiate, to satisfy the akira, what's going to be in the reverse circumstance? What if he takes out a gegeres, he does the akira on a sheer gegeres le'achila for the sake of eating, and the gegeres indeed is the required amount for achila. V'tzamka, it shrunk. Now he decides, I'm going to use it for planting. Now for zriya, we don't need a full gegeres. Even a lesser amount of this food is sufficient for zriya. What's going to be halacha in this case? Hachavada here, certainly, ki ishtik. If he would have remained silent, meaning he wouldn't have changed his mode. Ki ishtik amachshava kamaisa lemechayev. If he would have stayed silent, if he wouldn't have changed his plan, amachshava kamaisa lemechayev, he would have never been liable, never been chayev, due to the first machshava, because it lost his shear. Once again, his first machshava was for achila. That needs a gegeres. It shrunk. If he would have remained in that mode of achila, he would have been chayev, because we only have less than a gegeres now. So therefore, in this case, since the initial kavanah, the initial intent, the initial plan for achila can never come into fruition any longer, because it doesn't have the shear that can satisfy that initial plan. Therefore, we can't be mitzaref the akira to the hanocha. There's no connection, there's no correlation between two things. The akira and the plan contained therein can never come to fruition. We don't have the shear to satisfy the plan of the akira. So perhaps this drastic changeover in events, this turnover, it creates that disconnect between the akira and the hanocha. And therefore, loy mechayiv is not chayiv. Or perhaps you can say that here as well is chayiv. Why? Basar hashta linan. Let's follow the present. We follow hashta. Umechayiv is chayiv. Meaning, let's take a look at the present moment. Does he have enough volume here to address, to satisfy his current plan, which is Lazriya? Certainly he does. So we view each aspect independently. During the akira, did he have enough? For his plan then, yes, he had a kigeres for achila. During the hanocha, does he have sufficient volume to address, to satisfy his current intent, his current plan, which is Riya? Yes. So he's chayiv. We can combine the akira and the hanocha, even in this case. Says the Gemara. Now, let's go a step further. If you say that basa hashtazlin, we follow the machshava, the current plan, u'mechayiv, and therefore is chayiv since there's sufficient volume to satisfy his current plan. What's going to be the halacha in the following case? We have a fourth scenario. What's going to be in the case where he lifts the gergeres, he's moitzi a volume of gergeres la'achila for the sake of eating. V'tzamka, it shrunk. V'chazer v'tafcha, and then it bloated again, and it regained its former size. What is the halacha in this case? So, for instance, the akira and the hanacha were both with the same kavana. For instance, for achila, and it needs a shiur gergeres. But there was some sort of a transformation midway. It shrunk and then rebloated. What is the halacha here? Yesh dicha in Shabbos. Do we apply the concept of dicha? Do we say that it was pushed away? It lost its status when it comes to Shabbos? Or ain't dicha in Shabbos? Perhaps we don't apply dicha here. Take it, we leave it unresolved. Let's take a look at Rashi, who explains for us this concept of dicha. Rashi here has 13 lines from the bottom. Yesh dicha. So once again, we had a gergeres. We started with gergeres. We ended with a full share, but in the middle we lost it for a small amount of time. Do we say that the chayfetz becomes nitcha, becomes pushed away? It says Rashi, Mashachosher ben time. The fact that it lost its volume in between, ilu ancha ba'yishat mechayev. Theoretically, if he would have done the hanocha at that point in time, when it did not contain the proper share, he wouldn't be chayev. Mi amrin, do we say tiras dichoi? Do we apply the concept of dichoi? The nitcha loy michiyev chatos. It got pushed away from chiyev chatos or batal akira, and the akira becomes batal, becomes nullified. V'chi hadar tafcha v'yinicha. And even though later it resumes its former status, it regains its volume, its quantity. It bloated again. V'yinicha, now he placed it on the ground. Have hanocha b'le akira. It is looked at as a hanocha without an akira. There's a disconnect here between the akira and the hanocha, since in between it lost its status. It wasn't suitable for the ma'isa v'atzah, for the melacha v'atzah. It didn't have the shear, so it became nitcha. Or perhaps you say no, ein dicha in Shabbos. We don't apply concept of nitcha. Fact is that during the akira we had a shear, during the hanocha we had a shear, and that is sufficient for our purposes. Teku, we leave it unresolved. So in summary, we learned 4 cases in our Gemara. So we began with the case where the akira took place with a full share of gergeres, with a machshava of achila, for instance, and then the hanocha took place also with a share gergeres, but the machshava changed, the plan changed. He decided to use it for zriya, or in the reverse, he began with the machshava of zriya, concluded with the machshava of achila. In this case, as the Gemara certainly is chayav, because the share that was present b'shas the akira during the time of lifting the item was sufficient to address both plans, the initial and the subsequent plan. Therefore, the akira is mitzvah to the hanocha and is chayav. What's going to be in the following 3 cases? In a case where he began with a half a gergeres, so he did the akira on a half with the machshava to use it for zriya, and then tafcha had bloated, it swelled into a full gergeres, and now he decided to use it for achila. Says, well, perhaps in this case as well will be chayav. Why? Because the current shear is sufficient to satiate the current plan, as well as to satisfy the initial plan. There's no real contradiction, if so, between the end and the beginning, because this gergeris is sufficient for the achila, and theoretically sufficient for the zriya, which was his initial plan. So theoretically, if he would have remained with that plan, he would have had sufficient volume during the hanacha to bring his initial plan into fruition. Therefore, says the Gemara, in this case, perhaps he will be chayiv as well. But what's going to be in the next case? We began with a full shir gergeris with the machshava of achila, and then tzamka, it shrunk into a half gergeris, and now he decided to use it for zriya. So the hanacha took place with a half gergeris, with the kavana of planting, of zriya. Says the Gemara, perhaps in this case as well will be chayiv, because we view the akira independently and the hanacha independently, and the akira had sufficient quantity, sufficient share to satisfy the plan of the akira, which was achila. The hanacha as well has sufficient quantity to satisfy the plan of zriya during the hanacha. Therefore, we view each one independently, and we can combine the two things, the akira to the hanacha. Perhaps he'll be chayiv in this case as well. Says the Gemara, but what's going to be in the following case? We began and ended with a full share of gergeris. So he started the akira with a gergeris, for instance, for the sake of eating. Then it shrunk and regained its former size, so went back up to gergeris. In this case, says the Gemara, perhaps we will apply the concept of dichoy, since at the point of tzamka, when it shrunk, it was not suitable anymore for the share, for the malacha v'etzah, didn't have a share. Perhaps it gets removed, gets pushed away from the chiv of Shabbos, and we can't anymore combine the akira to hanachat. There's a disconnect between the two, and we can't be mitzaref them, or perhaps we can be mitzaref them, and we leave it unresolved. That's interesting that the Gemara discusses the case of tafcha, when something bloats, something swells, and we view it as though it has this new shear. So if the half gergeris turns into gergeris through bloating, we view it as something which has a shear gergeris. Says the Rashba, this seems to be a bit different than elsewhere in Shas, where perhaps we don't take into account the bloating and the swelling. So why is this case different? Says the Rashba, because when it comes to Shabbos, we're speaking about significance, chashivas. The shiurim here are based on importance, significance. As long as it looks significant, as long as it has the large size here, regardless of the fact that it came about through bloating and through swelling, that is sufficient. That is considered to be a proper shiur for chashivas, for haitzah. Continues the Gemara. Rav asked the following question of Nachman. What's going to be in a case of Zora Kazayas Truma? L'bayis Tameh. If one throws, he's standing in Rosh Hashanah, for instance, and he takes a Kazayas, a volume of Truma, and throws it into a Bayis Tameh, for instance, a Oyel HaMeis, there's a dead person there, anything that's under the same roof becomes Tameh. Ma, what's the halacha here? Says the Gemara, Lamai. Pertaining to what issue are you asking this question? Ilin in Shabbos. Do you mean to ask whether this person will be chayiv for Haitzah Shabbos because he tossed this kazayis truma from one domain to the other? Gergeris binan. We have a share of gergeris when it comes to food. Kazayis is not sufficient. Ilin in tuma. Are you asking in the context of truma of tuma? As Rashi explains that in order for something to be metame tumas oichlin, so it appears from Rashi that there's no sheer a minimum requirement for kabbalas tumah. In other words, even a small amount of food can become tummy, but in order for it to transfer tumah further, to convey tumah, to impart tumah, the food needs to have a volume, a sheer of a kabetza. Says the Gemara, ilin tumah. If you're asking regarding tumah, and you want to know whether this kazayis of truma that becomes tummy can go ahead and transfer tumah to others, kabetza, we need a sheer of kabetza for that. And kazayis is not enough. Says the Gemara, Shabbos. Certainly the question is regarding Shabbos. Ukagoin diika pachos mikabetza oichlin. So we're asking a question regarding the Melacha V'Tzah on Shabbos. Although generally we need a shir gergeris, and here we only have kazayis, perhaps. In this case, even a kazayis will be sufficient. Kagoin, for instance, for example, diika pachos mikabetza oichlin. So we have some food there in this bayis tameh, sitting on the floor there, less than a kabetza, less than a shir, which qualifies the food to impart tumah, to transfer tumah to others. V'hai mashlim lebetza. Now, when he throws this kazayis of truma next to the other food that's pre-existing there, for instance, their dough, right? So he throws it and attaches to the other part. V'hai mashlim lebetza, and they both now are completed into a betza. We have a shir, which equals the volume of a betza, and now it has the ability to be matame tumas oichlin. So by adding this bit to the pre-existing food there, he actually enables it. He enables the whole mass to be menatama to masaychlim. That's something chashiv, something significant. He's enabling something to happen here. What is the halach midah mitzaref linyan tumah? Do we say perhaps the fact that by combining with that pre-existing food there and enabling it to be metami to masaychlim, that is something of significance. He triggered a halachic chiddush here. He did something. It is chashiv. It is an act of importance. Midah mitzaref linyan tumah, since he's mitzaref in the context of tumah mechayev, nami linyan Shabbos. Perhaps we can carry over that significance in Shabbos as well, since this ma'isa of itzah, this ma'isa of throwing the kazayis into this home, by doing so, the truma, the little bit of truma becomes tamei, and when it attaches itself to the other food there, it joins them, and they now total a shear of kibetza, and they are enabled to impart tuma to others. That is an act of significance, of chashivas. Do we say that just as it is considered to be chashav for tumah, midah mitzaref linyan tumah, since they combine and join and become enabled when it comes to tumah, mechayev nami linyan Shabbos. When it comes to Shabbos as well, he's liable, because it is considered to be an act of significance, although there's less than a standard shear here. He didn't throw a shear of kageris here, really a shear of kazai, which is a smaller amount. But it has significance. His ma'ase's act carries special significance. It's enabling something. It's triggering something. Oidim perhaps no. Kollel in Shabbos, kageris beinan. When it comes to Shabbos, we need a kageris. Says the Gemara, Armalei, so Rav Nachman responded. Taniso, we learned the concept in a brayso. Abba Sholem, shtei alechem, v'lechem apanim, so shtei alechem were the two loaves brought on Shavuos, v'lechem apanim was on the shulchan throughout the entire week in the Beis HaMikdash, shi'uran kigageres. So if one carries out from these items on Shabbos, the shear is a gegeres, in line with the standard shear for Eichlan. Says the Gemara, V'amai, why do you need that much? Lema, perhaps we should say, midl inyan yoytze, because ayis. Just as when it comes to psul yoytze, Rashi explains, if he takes out kachim, karbonis from the Beis HaMikdash, it becomes invalid, it becomes disqualified, it becomes pasul b'yoytze. If one eats them, he is chayev, it's a lav, it's malchus. So why don't we say, just as when he merely takes out just a bit of kazayis from the Beis HaMikdash of the shtei alechem, for instance, it becomes nifsal b'yoytze, and it enables, so to speak, one to get malchus on it. So if one should eat this small amount of kazayis, he is chayiv malchus. It's a lav of yoytze, eating something which is yoytze. So why don't we say that even a small amount carries significance? Says Umar again, lema, midil inyan yoytze, since when it pertains to the psul yoytze, to the isar of yoytze, b'kazayis, there it is sufficient to merely have a kazayis. Linyan Shabbos, not maybe kazayis. So when it pertains to Shabbos as well, a kazayis should be sufficient. So if one should carry out even a small amount, even a kazayis of the shtei alechem from the Beis HaMikdash to Rosh Hashanah, he should be chayiv, because just as doing so enables it to hold somebody accountable and liable by eating this thing, by eating this yaitze, so it has significance. As chashivas, it triggers a halachic process. So likewise, when it comes to Shabbos, it should have chashivas significance. So if you propose that we can apply this concept, this formula, that if there's chashav for one thing, is regarded as significant for Shabbos as well, then it's not aligned with this brayso, which tells us specifically that we need a shear of gergeres, even when it comes to the lechem apanim or the shtei alechem. We don't apply this concept, that if it's chashav for something, it acquires significance for Shabbos as well. Says the Gemara again, then Shabbos not because. Why don't we apply this concept to Shabbos as well? Says the Gemara, says now you can't compare the two things. You can't make a raya from there. Why? Hasam over there with the afke chutz l'chayim azara. Once he carries out this shtei alechem outside of the wall of the azara, if it's b'yotze, at that point already it becomes pasul b'yotze because it left the azara. Shabbos lo mechayev. Adam mapikli l'shus. However, the Yitzah of Shabbos only takes place when he actually carries it further into Shus Rabbim, which is further away Therefore, it's a two-phase process. They're not happening simultaneously. The Psul Yotze happens way before the Chiyuv Shabbos. Therefore, there's no relation, there's no relevance between one and the other. However, in our case, when he throws this bit of truma into the home, so at the moment of landing of the hanocha, they're both happening simultaneously. Shabbos, the hanocha, when it comes to completing the malacha of Eitzah Shabbos, the tumah, and the triggering, the enabling of the tumas eichlin through combining with the pre-existing food here and completing the shear. Both phenomena are happening at once. Both happening simultaneously, perhaps. If it carries significance for tumah, by enabling and triggering the halachic process for tumah, perhaps it has significance for Shabbos as well, and a gergeris is not required. Perhaps merely a kazayis is sufficient in this case. So we leave it unresolved. Continues the Gemara. Chazar v'echnisa, the Mishnah told us that if one should carry even a small bit of seeds for planting purposes, but then Chazar, he changes his mind, and he decides not going to use it for planting v'echnisa, and brings it back in, and Kollel Shiur, he's only chayiv if it contains the proper prescribed shear. So in a pshita, of course, it's self-evident. There's no significance here. He doesn't intend on using it for Zriya. Says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, we're speaking about a specific case. He threw it into his storeroom, meaning he had no specific change of heart. He didn't specifically say, well, I'm not going to use it for Zriya. He simply did a Maisa, which indicates that it doesn't seem like he's really planning on using it for Zriya. He threw it into the storeroom, but it still can be told apart. It's still set apart from the rest, meaning it's still noticeable. He threw it in there, but didn't mix it up with the rest. You can still notice it apart from the others. Perhaps I would think, since it is still noticeable on its own, it still retains its former status. It still has that added significance, which it attained as a result of his initial plan to use it for Zriya. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah teaches us, since he threw it into the storehouse, Bituli Batle, he was a vatal, he nullified the significance, the special importance that he had granted this small bit of seed, and therefore he's no longer chayiv on bringing it back inside, on doing the hachnasa back into the home, unless it contains a proper prescribed shear, the standard shear applicable to all people. Continues the Mishnah, if one carries out food, and it places it on the threshold. The Gemara tells us that the threshold is a karmelis, so it's neither Rosh Hashanah nor Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, says the Mishnah, whether he himself picked it up again from the skupa and took it out, whether somebody else did that, potter. He's potter. Why? Because it wasn't one continuous ma'aseh. It terminated when he placed it on the threshold. Because it wasn't one continuous malacha. So he took the food from the home, which is sayachet, placed it on the skupa, which is the karmelis. So by putting it there, he terminated the malacha, and then when he continued on to Rosh Hashanah, it is regarded as a separate ma'aseh, does not connect with the initial akira, and there is no malacha. Says the Mishnah, Kupa Shimlei Peris, if we have a basket full of produce, he placed it on the outer threshold. Again, we're speaking about a skupa, which is a karmelis. Says the Mishnah Chiddush, even though most of the peris, most of the content of the produce is actually on the outside, on the outer side of the skupa, in Rosh Hashanah, potter. He is potter. Why? As called kupa, until he actually carries out the entire basket. The Gemara will explain exactly the meaning behind this halacha. Says the Gemara, let's go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. Haya skupa, hey chidami, haya skupa mai. The beginning of the Mishnah told us that if one carries food onto the skupa, by placing it there, he terminates the malacha, and he's not chayiv any longer by carrying it out further. Says the Gemara, hi askupa mai. What type of askupa are we speaking about? Now, obviously, this term askupa will apply to the sefer as well, to the second halacha of the Mishnah as well. So, which askupa are we speaking about? Ilaim askupa Rosh Hashanah. Are we speaking about askupa which has a din of Rosh Hashanah? For instance, it's within 3 tefachim to the ground, etc. It has a din of Rosh Hashanah. Potter? How can you say it's potter at placing it there? How come mafik Rosh Hashanah? When he takes something from the home, which is sayachet, and places it on the skupa, he is carrying from Rosh Hashanah. Says the Gemara, Ella rather askupa Rosh Hashanah. We're speaking about askupa which has din of Rosh Hashanah. Okay. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, Beisha chaza b'etzion. Beisha tzion acher pater. Mishnah says, if he takes the item from the home, from the Rishus HaYachid, places it on the askupa, which is the Rishus HaYachid, so up until now, at this point, he's okay. He hadn't done a malacha b'etzah at all. The Mishnah continues, however, and says that if he should go ahead and lift it off the askupa, which is Rishus HaYachid, and carry it out, or somebody else should do the same thing, he's pater. Says the Gemara, why is he pater? If the askupa, the threshold, is a Rishus HaYachid, Hakam mapik, Rishus HaYachid Sharabim. He's doing a full-fledged Ma'aseh Yitzah. He's carrying from the askupa, which is Sayachid, into the Rishus Harabim. Ella, rather, it must be askupa karmelis. We're speaking of askupa as din of a karmelis, and therefore, certainly that breaks up the Ma'aseh. And if he takes the oichel from the home, which is Sayachid, and places it on the askupa, which is the karmelis, so he lands it there, he places it on the karmelis, and then afterwards lifts it again, and continues on to Rishus Harabim. It is not one continuous malacha, and therefore he's pater. V'kamash, when the Mishnah teaches a chiddush here, Taima denach bekarmelis. This halacha only applies if it actually landed in the karmelis. If he placed it down on the karmelis, holei nach bekarmelis mechayev. But if he had not placed it down on the karmelis, he's chayev. Although he walked through the karmelis, that's irrelevant. Mas nisan loike ben Azai, says the Gemara. Apparently, our Mishnah is not following Shita ben Azai, who holds that even walking through a karmelis terminates the malacha b'eitzah, because ben Azai holds. We learned this earlier on Daf Hey. If one walks, it's as though he's standing. The fact that he places his feet on the ground, that is regarded as a ma'aseh hanocha. The Sanya is related to the Brisa. If one carries from mechanus, which is Sayachid, a store, leplatia out to the plaza, which is Rabim, derech stav, but he walks through the stav, the place that contains benches, and it is a karmelis. Chayev. So according to Tanakam, is chayev. Why? Because he merely walked through it. He never did hanocha. Uben azai poiter. But now it says he's pater because walking through an area is regarded as though he stood there, though he did the hanocha. So he placed the item on the floor. Therefore, in our case as well, in our Mishnah, merely walking through the skupa, which is the karmelis, would terminate the malacha b'eitzah, and it is considered as though he placed the item down on the skupa and he would be pater. Continues the Gemara. So the latter part of the Mishnah said, kupa shimlei peros, if he had a basket full of peros, and he placed it out on the skupa, Mishnah says that even if most of the pears are outside, he's pater until he actually carries out the entire kupa. Says the Gemara, Amar Chizkiya, Lo yishanu. This halacha only pertains ella bekupa meleya kishun midloim. If this basket contains these long items, long vegetables, for instance, cucumbers, gourds, where in that case the vegetable is not entirely outside until he takes out the entire kupa, entire basket. So merely having part of the kupa on the outside of the skupa sitting in Rishus Harabim is not sufficient because part of the vegetable is still inside. Therefore, it's heated into a ma'aseh b'eitzah. But if this basket is full of small-sized produce, for instance, chardal, mustard seeds, in this case, he's chayav. Why? Because on the outer part of the basket, the part of the basket that's situated on the outside of the skupa, the outside of the threshold in Rishus Harabim, there are mustard seeds there, and they are completely outside. Therefore, he's chayiv. Al Mokasavar, apparently Chizkiya holds, Eged Kli, Loishme Eged. The fact that the Kli is still tied to the inside, meaning it's still connected with the interior part of the Kli, is still on the karmelis, or still in Rishus HaYachid. It's irrelevant to us. We don't focus on the kli, on the container. We focus on the content. We focus on the pears inside. So if any of those mustard seeds are right now technically on the outside of the skupa sitting in Rishus Harabim, the fact that the kli is still inside, it's irrelevant. The agad kli, lo shmei agad, the fact that the kli is still tied up inside, is still partially inside, it doesn't bother us. We don't focus on the kli, we focus on the content. Rabbi Yechon Amar, afilu milei chardal pater. Rabbi Yechon says even if this kli contains small-sized items, for instance, mustard seeds, he'll be pater, although technically speaking, some of the seeds are already sitting in Rishus Harabim. Al Makasav, apparently Rabbi Yechon holds, Eged Kli, Shmei Eged. Apparently Rabbi Yechon holds that the fact that the kli is partially inside, Eged Kli means the kli is still tied, it's still tied up with the interior. Shmei Eged is considered to be tied up even pertaining to the content. So even though technically speaking, the mustard seed is on the outside, is actually Inushas Rabim, but since it's in a container, which is partially inside, which is tied up inside, that affects the content as well. The Rambam explains, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, anything in a Kli is regarded as one unit. The Kli is combines it's mitzarefed into one unit. We don't view the content as independent from the container, and therefore since the container is partially inside, and there's no malacha v'yitzah that is pertaining to the container itself because it's still tied up inside it wasn't completely taken out. Therefore that status applies to the content as well. Eged kli shmei eged. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rav Zera. Mas Nisan, if we'll take a close look at our Mishnah, the loich Chizkiya daika, it doesn't seem to be aligned. The wording don't seem to be aligned with Chizkiya, or the loich Rabbi Yochanan daika, nor does it seem to be aligned with Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, the loich Chizkiya daika, loich Rabbi Yochanan daika. The Chizkiya loich daika, it doesn't seem to be compatible with Chizkiya, diktani, because it says, Achiyetis kol kupa. The Mishnah says if he takes the basket and places it on the askupa, he is pater until he takes out the entire basket. Time of the kollel kupa. Apparently, we depend on the kupa itself. If the kupa is out, he's chayiv. Otherwise, he's pater. Ha kol haperos. But if he hadn't yet taken out the entire basket, although the entire pears were taken out, the entire content, for instance, the mustard seeds, which are on the exterior portion, in the exterior portion of this kupa, which is fully outside, it's irrelevant. He's pater. Alma kasavar. Apparently, Mishnah holds eged kli shmei eged. The fact that the kli is tied up, eged kli, it's tied up within. It's still partially inside. Shmei eged. That is considered to be tied up, even regarding the content. So once again, the Mishnah tells us that in order to be chayv, he needs to take out the entire basket. It is not sufficient that the content is outside. Apparently, the basket is what determines. Continues the Gemara. The Mishnah doesn't seem to be in line with Rabbi Yochanan either. Because the Mishnah says, although most of the content is outside, he is a pater. Time of the Rav Paris. Apparently, it's only because most of the Paris are outside. Hakal Paris. However, in the case where we have the entire content, the entire unit, the entire mustard seed is outside, that is sufficient. It's only because it wasn't the entire produce. For instance, he had this long cucumber. And the Mishnah says, even if most of it is outside, that is not sufficient. Apparently, it's because partially it's still inside. But if you would have, theoretically, something which is fully outside, a small mustard seed, even though the kupa, the basket, is still agida, is still tied up migavoy from within, he's chayiv. Apparently, the Mishnah holds, eged kli lo shmei eged, the fact that the kli is tied up within, that doesn't affect its content. Says the Gemara Kasha. Apparently, we have a kasha to both the Chizkiya and Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, Chizkiya metaris tamei. Chizkiya will interpret the Mishnah in accordance with his shita. Rabbi Yochanan metaris tamei. Rabbi Yochanan will do the same according to his shita. Chizkiya metaris tamei. He will interpret the Mishnah as follows: Achi yotzis kol kupa. When the Mishnah says he needs to take out the entire basket, otherwise he's pater. When is it said? Bekupa malaya kishun v'dloim. When the basket contains cucumbers, gourds, where in which case the vegetable is not entirely outside until he actually carries out the whole kupa. Because these are long vegetables, he needs to carry the entire kupa outside in order for the content to be outside. However, if it's full of seeds, of mustard seeds, nasa kimi, in that case, he doesn't actually have to take out the entire basket. Even merely taking out it partially will be sufficient. It is as though he took out the entire kupa. It's irrelevant where the basket is, as long as the content is outside. And therefore he's chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan, he will interpret the Mishnah according to his view. The Mishnah says, even though most of the content of the produce is outside, he is pater. So this is the first halach. And not only in this case, when most of it is outside and partially still inside, part of the cucumber is still stuck inside, he is pater. Call pears pot, even if the entire fruit is outside, he's pater. Called kupa, until he takes out the entire basket, because the basket is the container which determines the status of the content. So the Mishnah here is telling us two dinim. First, a more simple din, and then comes a bigger chiddush. Even if the entire content is outside, it's irrelevant until he actually carries out the entire basket. Meisvei, we have a kash from a brisa on Chizkiya. The Brisa says, if one carries out this peddler's basket, which contains these sub-containers within, he placed it on the exterior threshold, even though most of the containers, most of the species, the varieties that are in this large basket are to be found on the outside of the threshold, Potter, until he actually carries out the entire basket. Says the Gemara, the Gemara at this point thought we're speaking about bitzari, we're speaking about small bundles of ground besamim. So kasha lechizkia. So most of these things are outside. Roiv mina machutz. So we have a large container, a peddler's basket, and the bundles are actually on the outside of the threshold. Technically, they're in Shisarabim. The Brisa says he's potter until he actually carries out the entire basket. Kasha lechizkia. This is a kasha to Chizkia who follows the content. Lechizkia. We're speaking about bu'ur nasi. We're not speaking about small bundles. We're speaking about long stalks, bundles of long stalks of cinnamon, etc. Where in that case, the entire bundle is not outside until he actually carries out the entire basket. So until he does that, the bundle is still partially inside, and therefore he's potter. But certainly, generally speaking, we follow the content regardless of the location of the container. So in summary, we learned the halacha that if one would carry out a kupa, basket, which contains mustard seeds, so partially outside, partially inside, according to Chizkia, he's chayiv, because the fact that the container is partially inside is irrelevant. Eged kli, the fact that the kli is tied up within loishme eged, it doesn't affect the content, and he's chayiv. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we follow the container, eged kli shme eged, and he's potter. The Gemara told us that this only pertains to small size items, for instance, chardal, mustard seeds, but if there are kishuim vidluim, these long vegetables, or urnesi, these long bundles, the Gemara soon will say nascha, long pieces of silver, the kuliyam all agree in these cases that the only way we have a malacha v'yitzah is if the entire object, the entire item, the entire cucumber is fully outside without even a small portion of it remaining inside. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We began with the shiurim, which were determined by the Chachamim when it comes to the Melacha Veitzah. The Gemara told us, the Mishnah told us, that if a person will have a unique need for even a smaller amount, he regards it as significant and chashav, even a small amount of seeds for Zriya is considered to be sufficient for him. However, if he decides, well, these standard shiur apply to all, don't apply to me, I need a much larger amount, in that case, it doesn't change. Batla daita, his mind becomes nullified. We follow standard procedure which were prescribed by the Chachamim to all equally. Then we'll proceed with four cases, where there's some sort of discrepancy between the Akira and the Hanacha. The first case we have the Akira and the Hanacha both taking place with a shiur of a gergeris. However, the intended purpose changed. For instance, if the Akira was for the sake of eating, the Hanacha was for the sake of planting. The Gemara says certainly in this case he's chayav. What does it mean in the case where he began with a half gergeris? He did the akira of a half for the sake of zriya. Then it bloated, it swelled into a full gergeris, and now he decided he wants to eat it. So the hanacha was on a gergeris for the sake of achila. Here too says the Gemara, perhaps this will be okay because the current shear of gergeris can satiate the current plan of achila and can satiate the initial plan of zriya. What about in the case where he began with a full shear of gergeris and he had plans to eat it, and then samka it shrunk into half size, and he did the hanacha with the plan, with the purpose to do zriya with it. In this case, perhaps he'll be chayav because each one independently, each element, the akira was okay because there was a gergeris for achila. The hanacha was okay because there was a half gergeris for zriya. Perhaps we view each one independently, and they can combine now with tzara for shir for a ma'aser hitzah. Finally, says the Gemara, if he began and ended with a gergeris, but in between something happened, it shrunk and then regained its size, perhaps we can use the concept of dichoy, since it is no longer useful for melacha veitzah when it had shrunk. Perhaps it loses its status and cannot regain its status, and therefore there is a disconnect between Akira and Hanoch and his pater, and the Gemara leaves it unresolved. The Gemara told us perhaps when something has significance for another halachic procedure for tumah, perhaps that gives it chashivas for Shabbos as well. We left that unresolved, and finally we discussed the machlokes, whether we follow the content or we follow the container. According to Chizkiah, we follow the content. So the mustard seeds that are found outside are considered to be outside, despite the fact that the basket is still partially inside. Eged kli, loy shmei eged. According to Rav Yochanan, we follow the container. The fact that the basket is still partially inside, it is tied up inside, that prevents the ma'aser itself from taking place on the content. Eged kli, shmei eged.